The first thing I want to talk about is, if you've been following along, I had postmodernism on the course schedule. And postmodernism is basically a philosophical movement. And it's the type of movement that tends to change the world. So, we could look at different periods of history in China, let's say, where there were different dynasties, and then moving forward, they become communist, and so we sort of separated off in that way. Think of these ideological, philosophical movements like that. Postmodernism, you can see it in art, in music, in literature, certainly in education, and in many other areas. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on it because it's not that important for us to know the painful details. So I'm just going to give you the 30,000-foot flyover, so to speak, and that will be sufficient. So where did this movement begin? I think we could safely trace the origins back to the Frankfurt School in Germany. The Frankfurt School was a university that was completely devoted to advancing the principles of Marxist ideology. Openly. They were Marxists. They made no excuses about it. They were openly trying to advance those theories. So all of the professors and all of the instruction there was designed to support and advance the bankrupt and pernicious ideas of Karl Marx.
And
We'll put the internet for it.
just to be clear, Marxism is like trying to get your message across with violence, or did I?
No, not necessarily, although there were times when Marx certainly appeared to advocate such a thing. Marxism is, it's kind of hard to nail down specifically what it is. I'll do a talk on that outside of class later this semester, but I think I have a couple videos that I recorded of previous speeches on the YouTube channel that I use if you want to check those out. As I said, it's very difficult to describe what it is. It's kind of more of it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, rather than here's what it is. It's just not those things, which is why it's often confusing to people. But I'll make sure that those are live if you want to check those out, gain a little more insight into it. So the Frankfurt School was completely committed to advancing the ideas and principles of Marxism overtly. So pretty much just like the universities and colleges in the United States today, except they were openly talking about doing it. They weren't surreptitious the way that many colleges and universities are in the US today. But the Frankfurt School was closed down in 1933 because Adolf Schicklgruber, or as you know him, Adolf Hitler, was not a fan of having competing ideologies in universities in his country. They were advancing ideas of National Socialism or Nazis. And so Hitler closed the Frankfurt School in 1933. Most of the scholars there, in the immediate aftermath, they fled to Geneva, Switzerland, and then after that they collected around Columbia University in New York. And that's where most of them remained until after World War II. So that's where a Marxist foothold was kind of established in the United States, if you wanted to put the flag there. So you could basically say Columbia University in New York, and then also their ideas kind of spread to the Sorbonne, which is a big shot university in France. But the issue that they ran into after World War II was that it was no longer fashionable to be advancing the ideas of Marxism. And the reason was because there were tens of millions of recorded deaths as a result of the implementation of Marxism and communism. So it's kind of hard to sell that idea once the death toll came in. So it changed. A lot of the ideas of the Marxists from Columbia University and other places, they ended up manifesting in the Sorbonne in France. There are a couple of influential thinkers there. Jürgen Habermas, Derrida, Foucault, several others that were very influential. And instead of Marxism, it kind of morphed a little bit because, as I mentioned, tens of millions of deaths, you can't talk about Marxism anymore. And that's where it became postmodernism. It's a philosophical movement. So that's just a quick flyover of the evolution of that. This is, I've assembled this as a general theory about it. Of course, people disagree. We could have conversations about that, but we don't have time, so we'll leave it there for today. Basically, postmodernism has a central tenet that says there is no objective truth. Now that's a bit troubling because it seems rational to notice that there in fact is objective truth. Remember, we talked about objective truth and subjective truth prior to your informative speeches. So objective truth would be things that are true whether we want to agree or not. They're empirically verifiable. Can't deny them. Water is H2O, et cetera, et cetera. Subjective truths would be like, I prefer blackberry pie to pumpkin pie. I think that's the best. Well, someone might disagree. They'd be well within their rights to do so. It's perspective-based. But we could look around, let's say, I can say there are 16 people in this room right now. Would anyone want to deny that that's objectively true? So it does seem to be a peculiar central thesis for a movement. Now, one of the reasons, let me just back up a step, one of the reasons that Marxism, as an unadulterated and naked set of ideas, fell out of popularity was because of all the deaths associated with it. So you're all familiar with the Holocaust? And what were the approximate numbers there, do you know? About 6 million. Yeah, 6 million Jews, intellectuals, homosexuals, Roman Catholics, dissidents, Poles. There were many people, gypsies. So that 6 million figure doesn't belong to one group. It's worth pointing out, although the Jews definitely got the brunt of that, there were many other groups that were sent to death camps by Hitler as well. How many of you have heard of the Holodomor? Holodomor is what occurred in Ukraine, also in the 1930s. It's the other genocide that they don't teach us about in school. Why? I don't know. Perhaps because we didn't participate in a worldwide war to end it, but most people have never heard of the Holodomor. Basically, Stalin wanted to collectivize the farms in Ukraine and make them communist. And the model in the 1930s, early 30s, was basically that of a capitalist model. So you had farm owners, and they would hire out people to work on the farms and pay them a wage for doing so, much like you'd find in the United States today. One thing to note about Ukraine is the reason that this was so hotly contested is the same reason that Ukraine is referred to as the breadbasket of the world. The farms there are abundant and the soil is notoriously rich. They have expressions in Ukraine, and they'll say that you could take an old tire and throw it in the soil and it would grow something. That's how fertile the soil is. Actually, when Hitler invaded Russia, he had trains going into Ukraine to steal the soil because it was so notoriously fertile and good to grow anything, and sent trainloads of it back to Germany. Seems like kind of a silly idea. I don't know if they were ever to make anything significant out of that, but he did try to. And so about 5 million people died in the Holodomor, and the way that happened was Stalin launched a campaign to demonize the farm owners in Ukraine. To say, like, these were evil people who were controlling others, and they would just pay a pittance to the workers, and then they would keep everything for themselves, and the workers deserved a bigger slice of that. It was kind of the communist mentality. And he ran a very effective propaganda campaign to demonize the farm owners, referred to them as kulaks. Kulak is it's basically like a Russian vulture. So he essentially was characterizing them as vultures who preyed on other people. And here's one of the examples. If any of you have been to my office, I have this poster on my wall. You may recognize it. And so they were demonized in the following way. You can see that they were always characterized as, you know, these big fat guys, and kind of have this evil look in the eye, big noses. And notice there, he is propping himself up on these canes that represent religion. And he has the rifle. So these evil farm owners, as Stalin characterized them, relied on the support of their religion and their guns. And this is a very common theme in the propaganda posters. And it resulted in, with assistance from the Russian army, a revolt in Ukraine whereby the workers on these farms rose up, and in most cases they killed the farm owners. There were a small number of them that were rounded up and essentially deported to the Siberian Peninsula, essentially dropped off there in the middle of winter with nothing. Here you go, get out, in the Siberian wilderness, where they lived under the most miserable conditions. Many of them froze to death. Most of them died. Some of them did live through it. However, it was unspeakable conditions. We don't need to go into detail about that. But the net result, what happens when you kill off all the farmers in the country? Yeah, there's no food, and then everybody starves to death. And that's exactly what happened. So Holocaust, essentially, loosely, is a death by fire or something like this. And Holodomor would be death by starvation or famine genocide, is essentially Holodomor. So about 5 million people starved to death in Ukraine after this happened. Here's an image. This is a particularly haunting picture. This kind of speaks to cognitive dissonance, which we talked about in the last lecture. So here you can see there's a woman, and she's on her way to work. There's a couple of them there. She's got the shawl on, and she's dressed nicely, and she's headed to work. And there are people on the sidewalk who have starved to death, and their bodies are still there, or they're starving to death. And despite this horror that they were living in during the famine, the cognitive dissonance, people still got to go to work. Don't pay attention, just go to work, keep going to work, do what you got to do, everything will be okay. And who could blame them living through that kind of horror? But it's images like this that really capture the true horror of that famine. So, anyway, it's things like this that made it very unpopular to continue to sell Marxism as a set of ideas to the general public through universities. And I would assert to you that that is the basis, that a lot of their ideas morphed and spread and became postmodernism. So there is no objective truth, is the central tenet of postmodernism. There is no objective truth. That seems kind of silly, but you may have heard of versions of this. So if we were to take, let's say this is a tree of postmodernism, and so this is the trunk where it starts in the ground. Perhaps the main branch here, you would find what is called social constructivism. Social constructivism really embodies this notion that there is no objective truth. Just so I can demonstrate to you how this plays out in a practical way. How many of you have heard the term for the concept of social construct, maybe in a college class or somewhere else. So people will say, well, this is just a social construct. Well, some things clearly are social constructs. And I don't think you could find much disagreement. So, for example, the value of money. The value of money is clearly a social construct. The US dollar it's not even backed up by gold or any type of precious metal anymore. Even if it were, what is the inherent value of gold? Nothing. We just decided that that would be worth something because it was a limited supply and it's shiny. But at the end of the day, it's a mineral. But US currency is nothing, it's just paper and ink, right? There's nothing inherently valuable about that. God didn't bestow some magic value that this shall be worth approximately $20 worth of goods and services if exchanged. The only thing that gives us value is the fact that we all agree that it has value. That's it. It's a fiat currency. So the value of money is obviously a social construct. I don't think you would find very much disagreement about that. There are others. Borders. Of countries or states, even. Those are socially constructed. A border is the result of hundreds or thousands of years worth of wars and struggle and cultures developing, and then eventually the establishment of borders in certain areas. But especially if we're talking about state borders, if you're in New Mexico and you cross into Arizona, you might see a sign that says, you know, welcome to Arizona, leaving New Mexico, or something like that. That'd be your only indication. You know, there's no laser line that God etched into the sand where you go, oh wow, look, there's the border. That's what we see on the map. It's just an idea. It's just a boundary that we place there for practical purposes. That's a social construct. Marriage is a social construct. Again, as long as I wear something nice and my romantic partner wears something nice and our families are present and we're standing in front of someone with a funny collar and that he goes through the ritualized language and at the end of it we each say I do, then magically, poof, you're married. But there's nothing that actually makes us married. And, you know, if my spouse has an affair, she isn't, you know, zapped by the nature of the universe, doesn't just, unfortunately. But that's a different story. Yes, sir?
So marriage is a social construct. Would the concept of relationships be one as well, or just are not?
Probably so, yeah.
That is more time biologically with that.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, biological necessity, all kinds of dimensions, but whatever rules that we place on it, whatever boundaries we put on them, those are socially constructed. However, you do get into some concepts that are a little bit more difficult to determine whether or not they're in fact social constructs. And so I'm not here to tell you what to think about those. You'll have to come to your own conclusions. Don't take my opinion for anything. I'm a college instructor. I'm the last person whose opinion you should be taking. Oh, I'll just adopt his views because he's a college instructor. No, that'd be a terrible idea. You should remember that for future courses. The idea of race as a social construct. Is race a social construct? Well, yes and no. Try to give you both sides and be fair. It's true that we can look at DNA and we can find markers and ways to separate people into groups by characteristics. However, some people think that that's not a fruitful endeavor and that it's better to think of all people as part of the human race. The only problems with that, when you get into medicine, for example, is the idea that some people in some races, I'm sure every race is susceptible to certain things, but sickle cell anemia, for example, is more likely to affect people who are black. Certain types of diabetes also. I would be concerned, or I think those who are opposed to saying that race is a social construct would probably assert that if we did that and all the doctors just threw their hands in the air and said, well, yeah, it's just a social construct, then we would no longer be saying, hey, listen, I want to take a look at you to make sure that you don't suffer from sickle cell anemia or diabetes, or even myself, being of European descent, there are certain digestive disorders and problems that I am susceptible to that I need to get checked for. So if it's really a social construct, then wouldn't it be a silly endeavor to be checking me for certain things? So it seems to become unclear at that point. And I'll just leave it at that. Also, forensic scientists, if a body was found 40 years after the fact, buried somewhere, and all they had left was a skeleton, with greater than 85% accuracy, we could determine what racial origin that person was from. Were they white, were they Hispanic, Black, Asian, whatever it is. And I would say that the opponents of race as a social construct would maybe with some utility object to that, saying, well, if we agree to that, then there's no sense in running those tests anymore because it's just a made-up thing. And I think it's probably better to be able to bring justice to a family of a victim, and if we can do that by making those types of analyses, then we probably should. So I'll leave it at that. You come up with your own opinion about it. I don't know the answer. I can tell you what the controversy is and fill in both sides a little bit, and that's about it. The other one is gender. Is gender socially constructed? Again, like race, there are two sides to it. Some of it clearly is, right? There are norms and expectations that vary from culture to culture. Men typically don't wear dresses here, but if you went to Scotland, they like to wear kilts, which is kind of the same thing. So, in that way, yes, behaviors are somewhat socially constructed. But then the other side would probably say, well, there's a direct relationship to biological sex, and so in that way, it is not socially constructed. We're just going to put a question mark here, and I'll leave it at that. But that's the idea of social constructivism and some of the things that appear to be true, and then some of the problematic or disputed features of it, okay? And this is a bona fide academic theory now, postmodernism, and definitely social constructivism, so I'm certain you'll encounter this in other lectures, and I hope that your future instructors will be as fair and judicious as I have been to the debate on what it is, and you're free to come to your own conclusions on that. So, let's move to a different topic now. I want to shift gears. It's probably more about postmodernism than we needed to talk about, but I also want to mention the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now we're going to go to communication theory. A very fundamental communication theory, very important set of ideas, we'll say. Correct myself there. Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf both contributed to this set of ideas. And it basically says that, well, up until the, mid-1920s or so, when this theory was developed, or this set of ideas was developed, it was largely believed that language was used as an identifier only, kind of as labels. Words were just labels. So in other words, if I speak English and someone else speaks Mandarin, and then we have someone who speaks Spanish, or even ancient Greek, they're all essentially the same tool. They just have different words that are used as labels for things. So I would call this an eraser, and people who speak different languages would have different words instead, but it's the same thing. We're just using different words to refer to the same thing. Obviously, there's much more to language than just labels and words. There are ways to connect and structure sentences, but we don't have to worry about that. Sapir and Whorf surmise that there's more than just utility of labels to words. In other words, they're not just that, but that they actually also shape the way that you come to see the world, perceive the world, think about the world. In other words, depending on the language that you learn, there would be subtle differences in the way people perceive the world and think about things. After all, language is our only tool that we have to do that, so if we speak a different language, that seems to be, we can reasonably presume that that's probably the cause of cultural differences as well, right? At least in part. And so this was the set of ideas that was being advanced. Basically, language is a regulator of interpretation. That'd be the central thesis there. Now, I have to point out something very important to you here. What is a hypothesis?
Educated guess, or?
Yeah, very good. It's a set of ideas that you would begin with prior to running a scientific experiment. What is your hypothesis? Well, my hypothesis is that hamsters that are given more niacin when they're young will develop more muscle mass, something like this. So what do? I get a bunch of hamsters and I establish a control group and I give more niacin to some of them, and then when it's over I look at the results, and if I can repeat the results, then perhaps it will become a theory. Notice it's not the Sapir-Whorf theory. That's a little peculiar, isn't it? The reason it's not the Sapir-Whorf theory, and that it's forever stuck as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which isn't a theory at all, it's just a set of questions. So you might say, well, if it's just a hypothesis, then how can anything be gleaned from it? Some people do dismiss it. A very small percentage of communication scholars just outright dismiss it. They say it's just a hypothesis, it's never been tested, and so why bother with it? I think that that's inappropriate, and I'll explain why. But that's the gist of it. It's forever frozen in the hypothesis stage because it would be impossible to do an experiment to see if it's true. How would you run an experiment to see if languages and the languages that people learn end up causing them to perceive the world differently, interpret the world differently, actually think differently? What would you take twins when they're born, and like our experiment from the cave, you would separate them from their mother, and one would go to Gary, Indiana, and the other one would go to Beijing, and then after 20 years of learning the language and developing a perspective, you bring them back to compare. That'd be a terrible mother to allow such a thing. It's just not possible to run the experiment.
I was going to say, wouldn't you also need two controlled environments that are like exactly the same? Yeah. Absolutely. And not only that, but there's an even bigger problem, which is that twins don't necessarily grow up together and end up with the same views. They don't think the same way, they don't have the same perspectives, so there's really no way to run an experiment there. The best I could come up with is, perhaps if you could clone an infant in some unethical way, and yeah, there doesn't seem to be any way to run the experiment. But that doesn't mean that we can't see it in practice and surmise some connections. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is a shortcoming. It can't be tested. So you generally get people who agree on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is most communication scholars, and they're somewhere on this continuum from the weak to the strong. Those on the strong interpretation of it say, oh, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis explains everything. The language that you adopt is responsible for everything: your opinions, your attitudes, your preferences, your tastes, the way that you see the world, the way that you think about everything. It's 100% responsible. And those on the weak side of it kind of acknowledge the shortcoming of it being an untestable hypothesis and say, well, I think there's something to it, and we can look at some evidence that seems to indicate that, but let's not get carried away. In other words, language probably has some subtle effect on people. There are nuances to it, but let's not get carried away with the strong side. I would be toward the weak side of it. I think it is absolutely legitimate and valuable, but I'm not committed to the strong version of it, that's for sure. So there's that, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Any questions about what that is? We could kind of condense this, if you like. You could say this.
improve the environment, like indigenous. Does that make sense?
Perhaps.
I know there's one close together but still different languages constantly around each other.
Yes, that may get you a little closer, but you really wouldn't be able to come up with a bona fide scientific experiment there. But I see where you're going, for sure. You could say, therefore, if this is correct to whatever degree, if you could change the way that people speak, give them a different language instead of the one that they learn. If I grew up speaking French instead of English, it would change the way that I'm thinking. Right? It would have some effect on the cognitive ability, the words, the language that I have, the way I refer to things. How many of you in here speak 2 languages? I'll bet a lot of you speak Spanish, probably as well, maybe some other languages. I'll bet there have been times when someone has asked you, hey, how do you say this in your language? And maybe your response was, well, we don't really have a word that translates perfectly to that. Or maybe you said, well, we don't really see it that way, or we wouldn't describe it that way. Here's what we would say. Do you know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. I see some bunch of nodding heads. Yeah, that's the superior word hypothesis in action.
And also, another example is I know certain cultures or languages have different numerical systems that they work with. Would that be a pretty good example? Would that count under the whole language?
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah, probably. The numeric system, I think, would be under that umbrella as well.
Yeah.
Although they tend to be more universalizing because there's an element of math that no matter what you call the numbers, there are some different approaches to it. I'm not a mathematician, which is kind of surprising the number of times I took algebra in high school. You'd think I would be, but I'm not, so I can't speak to math. But yeah, I think a numeric system would be included in there. So those of you who speak 2 languages, you've had this experience before, you know what I'm talking about. That's the superior word hypothesis. We wouldn't say it that way, or we don't have a word for that. That's not quite how we would describe it. That's the superior word hypothesis, and that's what puts me on the weak side of it. So let's move from communication theory now into more social theory, if you will. And how many of you know what PC language is?
Like politically correct?
Politically correct language, yeah. How many of you know what that means? Oh, not many, okay, a few. Politically correct language. Politically correct language, you might define it as when you substitute new words that are less upending or potentially offensive, or they're more inclusive, that sort of thing. Where does it come from? It tends to come from the intelligentsia. That's just a $6 term for the 1%, we'll say, in society who are considered the pioneers, the entrepreneurial thought leaders. It would be, senators and elected officials, rich people, celebrities, college professors, that sort of thing. Who are the intellectual elite? And the intellectual elite typically have something at stake. They're speaking to large crowds, or they're looking to advance. And so they are interested in using language that is least likely to offend people, least likely to not be completely inclusive. And so just to give you a flavor of this, if we went back several decades and went into a restaurant, we might have a waiter or a waitress. But we don't have those today. What do we have? Servers, yes. Why do we have servers instead of waiters and waitresses? Because somewhere out of the intelligentsia, it was decided that that was a more inclusive term. Why do we need to be gender specific when we refer to the people who bring our food and take care of us in restaurants? I don't think that people who work in that industry were clamoring about the gender specificity of those terms. But this is part of the puzzling or bewildering nature of politically correct language. Most of us hear the new PC terms, we just kind of roll our eyes like, oh great, now we have to say this instead of this now. It's just kind of annoying. If we went back 40 years and got on a plane, you would have stewards and stewardesses. Today we have what?
Flight attendants.
Flight attendants, yes. Gender neutral, right? More inclusive, that sort of thing. California has become a real pioneer in politically correct language. So in California, as you might imagine, it's very coastal. There's a large heavy fishing industry there. Mostly men work in the heavy fishing industry. You've probably all seen that goofy crab show on the Discovery Channel. Is it on the cable? Good show, not knocking it. The crab fishing show in the Bering Sea off of the Alaskan coast. You find that pretty much anywhere. It's mostly men that work in the industry, and I don't think it's because they're strong-arming women out of the industry. I think women are just smart enough to go, yeah, I'm not going to do that stinky job that's dangerous, hard work all day long for a bum paycheck. I'll go to school and get a degree and do something that's a little better, that pays more. So I think it's a testament to their intelligence more than anything else. It's mostly guys, but at some point in California, the intelligentsia decided that we should not refer to them as fishermen because there are a handful of ladies who work in the industry. So you know what they call them now? They talk about an issue on the news. Fishers. Anglers, that would kind of make sense. They say fishers. Fishers. Today the fishers are arguing for a new contract in their union. Fishers.
English sounds cool though.
Anglers would be better, I agree.
Fishers.
So now there are terms that are politically correct, and especially in California, and these things catch on. They don't want you to say homeless. It would be something like, those who lack housing. It's the correct, politically correct term. Because homelessness carries connotations like, oh, that homeless person. Let's be honest about this. A lot of it is probably well-intentioned. Like, well, let's, drop those stigmas and the stereotypes, and so we'll just come up with a new term that's more inclusive. I don't think that is actually the net result. And remember, although things may be well-intentioned, and I always try to ascribe the best of intentions for my opponents, never judge them morally. Assume that they have the best of intentions until you know otherwise. But also remember that there's a road to a certain place that is paved with good intentions. If you're familiar with that expression, and it would be the road to hell, because a lot of things go off the rails when people happen to have good intentions about what they want the outcome to be. So some of this gets even crazier now, where I think there's backlash towards some of this in society, and it would be for people who are on parole, like out of prison, or they're on probation. And now the correct term is justice-impacted individuals.
Are you for real?
Yes, justice-impacted individuals.
Oh.
I'm not sure why we're so concerned about people who are getting paroled out of prison or on probation. I don't think they were probably clamoring for a different term, like, oh, that's awful, I just can't live my life being known as a parolee. I don't know that it helps them in any way, but there's a movement out there to do that. And perhaps maybe the most extreme end of this would be those who have committed the most horrible acts against children, sexual assault and that kind of thing, and they used to be just referred to as either child molesters or pedophiles. And so now the new term that a very small group of people who are clamoring about this prefers to use is MAPS. It's an acronym. This is a MAP. Has anyone heard this?
Yeah.
Do you know what it stands for?
Minor attracted person.
Minor attracted person, yes. I'm not sure why we're concerned about that group of people and how they might be affected by the term pedophile or child molester, presuming that they are guilty of having committed such crimes. But again, there's a small group of people advocating for that to be the politically correct term. Come to your own conclusions about that. I just wanted you to see there's a range of it. Some of it seems reasonable. Maybe it's better to say server or flight attendant. And then there's kind of the unclear area, fishers, or those who lack housing, and then you go to the other extreme with parolees and those on probation and the rest. So part of the problem here, and this is a little bit of behavioral psychology, is that when you make those substitutions, if you either censor yourself, so you stop using certain words or certain terms, or if you make those substitutions voluntarily, oh, okay, I'll just say this from now on instead of this. What does the superior worth hypothesis tell us?
Changes how we see it.
Yeah. If you're either self-censoring or you're making substitutions, regardless of the intention or regardless of if it seems like a reasonable politically correct term or unreasonable politically correct term, in any case, the superior worth hypothesis tells us that it's also going to change the way that we think. So just know that. You might make those substitutions, you might censor your speech, but it doesn't end there. The ultimate effect is that it's going to also change the way you think. Well, what do we know about changing the way that we think in behavioral psychology? Remember in the beginning of the semester I gave you this scenario, what if you were afraid of heights? How would you handle that? You would go to a psychologist and then they would have conversations with you and find out why you were afraid of heights. Maybe you fell out of a tree when you were a little kid and broke your collarbone and your dad was mad because he was just ready to sit down and eat dinner and now he had to take you to the emergency room. You were traumatized from it and that just developed into a fear of heights. And so the behavioral psychologist would have conversations in the office with you about it and basically get you to change the way that you think so that you would be able to go out and ride the escalator or get on a plane or get on an elevator and you wouldn't have to worry about it. Remember, no behavioral psychologist would say, well, we're going to bubble wrap you from the world so that you never have to get on a plane again, then you'll be over your fear of heights that way. The way that they do it is you go through essentially some talk therapy with them, and then that will change the way that you think, and that will change your attitude, ultimately change your behavior. So here's what we can surmise from that. Say that. When you change the way people think, you will inevitably change the way they behave. That's the basic principle of all behavioral psychology. So, superior worth hypothesis with behavioral psychology. Look how this comes together. If you change the way people speak, you will change the way they think. When you change the way people think, you will inevitably change the way they behave. Is politically correct language a pernicious mechanism that is designed ultimately to affect the way you behave? Perhaps. Perhaps, and again, perhaps it's well-intentioned. Maybe those who want to change the terminology for the group that was previously known as homeless people, maybe they are thinking that if we can get people to use different language, then there won't be a stigma attached to the term homeless, and people will see it differently, and they will support programs to help them, and then we can begin to solve the problem through that eventual behavior change, perhaps. Or perhaps they want you to use different words because they know it's going to change the way you think, and when you change the way you think, maybe part of the behavior they would like to see affected is the way that you vote. Now, we can't know that. I don't know of an experiment that we could devise in order to determine that. And again, I would prefer that we ascribe the best of intentions to people, even when they are our opponents. But it's certainly possible. Just know that much. Change the way you speak, you'll change the way that you think. When you change the way that you think, ultimately, it will definitely change the way that you behave. And so this is really the nucleus of persuasion, right there. From a psychological, philosophical perspective, that's the mechanism. So that's the theoretical side. And that's what we are looking to do when we want to persuade an audience. Remember, the definition of persuasion is to cause the audience to take some action. So, now that you've learned a little bit about all of these elements, how do you cause someone to take an action? Well, one way to do it is to get them to change the words that they use, get them to change the way that they speak, because you know that will change the way that they think, and when you change the way that they think, that will affect a behavior change. So that is the essence of persuasion right there.